Okay.
Okay. Hi, guys. Today, Jessica and I are going over the new buyer brokerage service agreement. And I asked Jessica to join me because they have something very similar in Idaho that they've been using for the entire time you've been an agent, right?
Yeah.
And they have to get it signed before working with any client, correct?
Yeah, before you can show any houses or
Yes. So
anything.
as soon as reasonably possible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So she's had experience with this for years now, and I think would be a good resource for everyone on the team.
Perfect. So when I present something like anything that really needs signatures or some type of formal commitment from a seller or a buyer, I always try to start with, hey, this is really great news.
Mm-hmm.
Or
yes,
there's this new change which is extremely beneficial to you. It just sets the tone for this being received well, and not saying, hey, here's this agreement, I need you to sign it to work with me.
Yeah.
No one likes to just sign random stuff. So the more that you can start a conversation with a positive, I think it sets the tone for
Absolutely.
going over something that seems maybe scary or it is contractual. So when I present something in Idaho, or if I spin it for Washington, I would say, hey, Christina, we've had some changes in Washington, which are really beneficial to you as a buyer. And I'm really excited about it. And here's some of the changes and how they can affect you and set you up for success while we're out shopping for homes. This form goes over how you and me can create a agency relationship. And the great thing is now you have a choice on what that agency relationship can look like. Beforehand, you would just sign to say that you would work with me, and I had any and all type of legal obligations, and there was not as much disclosure as I think anyone who had a representation would hope for. Now there's a lot of disclosure on both ends. First, you can see what the seller's offering. You can choose on your end what type of relationship you want, as well as the compensation on my end. So we can go over all of that now. And so the first thing here, we can choose how long of a relationship you and I can be in. For starters, I usually like to have 120 days. That's something that I choose. Anyone on the team, you can choose your own time frame. I don't think 60 days is very long. Personally, 120 is, longer than 3 months. It gives me more time, especially seasonality wise. Right now in the winter, I would like more time. They're probably not going to get under until spring or summer.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put something longer. So I would like to work with you to make sure we set you up for success for 120 days. The next thing, we've already gone over the real estate brokerage pamphlet, so we're just acknowledging that I gave that to you. It also speaks about which firm I'm with here. And then the really great thing is now you can choose the type of relationship you want to enter in. One is called exclusive. That's where you work with me exclusively, and I am the only real estate agent in our area that is representing you. The other option is non-exclusive. That's where you can enter into other relationship agreements with other real estate firms. We spoke about that in the buyer's consultation and how that can actually hinder you in the process. Most people that I work with, and if I chose someone myself, I would love to have someone represent me exclusively. And then give them an opportunity to talk about that.
Exclusive.
The next thing is it just talks about limited dual agency. And what that means is when I spoke about what types of houses I can show you, we had mentioned you'd probably want to see all the houses that are on the market, not just the ones that are listed by my team or my firm. Correct?
Yes.
Wonderful. So one thing, if you do see something that is listed by my brokerage and my firm only, I did mention how I will not double-sided deal. If it's my listing, I will pass on representation to someone else on my team. And because I believe that's in your best interest, and ethically, I don't believe I can represent both sides. Would you agree?
Yes.
Wonderful. So something we'll most likely want to have you choose for representation is dual agency
within the firm.
Yep. So we'll go over that if it, for some reason, we end up finding a home in-house that you really love.
Okay.
The next thing we can go over is compensation. So as you know, we've had a lot of changes, and one of the things that we can now disclose is the type of compensation and where that compensation is coming from for when you work with me. One thing that I request when you work with me is that whether it comes from you or the list side, I make a minimum of 2%, 2.5%, whatever that is, compensation when I help you purchase a home. What that means is if I see before we go out and look at a house that the seller is not offering that minimum compensation that we have agreed to, that difference or the makeup of it would come from you on your end. Of course, I would let you know because I can see beforehand if they're not offering that, and we can have a conversation about that at that time.
Yeah. The other thing too, I think within just like a side note of that is that if they're not offering that 2.5%, then you have the choice, buyer, if you would like me to go back to the seller and negotiate to see if they will come up to that 2.5%. Otherwise, it's your choice if you are willing to come up with the rest of that portion to make up that 2.5%.
Mm-hmm. And I would leave this as least complicated as you possibly can when presenting it to a buyer, because just like inspection responses, when you go over that in a broker or buyer's presentation, there's too many scenarios that you could possibly go over, and it's just going to be overwhelming. So I think if you leave it short and sweet and say, if this scenario comes up, we'll have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Then it just makes it seem a lot less scary to them. And hopefully, other agents like our team will be really well trained and versed in having those conversations with their sellers and have that compensation offered.
Yeah.
So we won't have to have this perhaps scary conversation, but it doesn't need to be scary. It just needs to be factual. And if you keep it short and sweet, it's not going to seem like something daunting to a buyer.
Yeah.
So,
do you think that you would let your buyer know that it can be amended down the line of what it would be, or the 2.5 is baseline?
I would just do a baseline because, again, I think there's so many scenarios. Of course, you have that type A personality or a high C who wants to read everything and wants to know every option, you're obviously going to change this conversation a little bit. But if you have more of that, first time home buyer, or perhaps someone who's just bought a house multiple times, is just wanting to get in and out of here, I would keep it short and sweet. And as you show something, you can bring up those scenarios if it comes up and say, hey, one of the great things in our offer is we can tweak this or we can tweak that. You're obviously always going to set your client up for success.
Yeah.
So
that's
unless there's some legal obligation to do it, I don't know if I would go over every scenario.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Next thing, it talks about the seller compensation. So how it will get paid to the firm or to the buyer. This is where we can go through and choose how that compensation gets allocated, and if there's additional compensation on top of the minimum 2.5% that we talked about, where that money would go to. So typically that additional does get sent to a firm. Can we say that?
Legally?
Yeah. And so that's what we see most commonly. However, if we know that it would change your offer or whatever, we can get more creative. So maybe this is a good area to bring that up.
Yeah, for sure.
Something. Compensation terms. This just goes over more of what we just touched on: exclusive agency, non-exclusive agency, the differences between it, all that good stuff. And then the next thing that we have to talk about, since you are not doing VA financing, we've already talked to your lender. We know you're going conventional or FHA. We can choose. Personally, myself, I will not show a listing to you if there is no compensation offered. So if you are not able to offer compensation, the seller's not able to, we've had that conversation with the seller, they're not able to come up with it even if we increase purchase price, then unfortunately we will have to most likely go in a different direction. Again, if this is something that comes up before we go see a house, I'm going to let you know. We're going to have that conversation so we can go over what that looks like. So, and yeah.
Perfect.
Pretty short and sweet.
Okay, cool. And then so for the amendment, I guess that would be those scenarios that come up. So if it's, obviously extending the term, to me, I do think that 60 days is short. I think my term would be the term of a pre-approval letter, which is typically like 120 to 90 days. So
Yeah.
within those terms.
Even 90 days is only 3 months, and I just don't think that's very long.
Yeah.
Especially if our market continues with such low inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I have a lot of buyers who are like, okay, if the right thing comes along, we'll jump. If it doesn't, then we're not going to.
Yeah,
And I don't want to
waiting
have
for the
them
perfect
sign
home.
this every 60 days.
Yeah.
And first-time home buyers, if rates change drastically between 1%, whether they go up or down, that changes a lot for them too, as
Right.
far as
their buying power
paying.
and everything.
Yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
I don't think
Yeah,
60
true.
days is plenty of time. It's honestly hardly even enough time if you went and found them something in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I personally would put something a lot longer
Yeah.
in there. And if you get a lot of pushback, I would always let them know exactly how to get out of this agreement. Even with our last buyer rep agreement in Washington, I always told my clients, hey, if for some reason you decide you don't want to work with me and we are not under contract, I specify that.
Yeah.
The way to get out of this is to email myself and my managing broker, who's listed on line 3 or whatever.
Yeah.
And you just let me know that you want to terminate this relationship. I'm obviously not going to force you to work with me if you don't like me. That doesn't set anyone up for success. And that just also helps this not be some scary thing.
The nice thing too is that right now on this new form is nice, but there's that will have both emails listed on
and
the
they don't
form.
have to look it up anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that that's a great thing to throw in at the end is
Mhm.
just let them know how they can get out of it. There's so many people I have conversations with who, on the list side or the buy side who said, oh yeah, I did sign something and, unfortunately we can't have that conversation with them, but we can let them know, if someone wants to end a relationship with me, this is how they get out of it.
Yeah.
And they're like, that person never told me I could even do that.
Yeah, I
And
always.
So
even with my listings, I typically put an addendum in there, like telling
Same.
them how they can, if ever needed, which
Yeah.
hasn't come up.
Right.
But I think that it gives them like reassurance that, you want you want to work for them, the relationship, and work for, the
and you just went
compensation
over
that you're
our
getting.
Blue Door guarantee, 100% satisfaction guarantee in our
Mhm.
consultation, and you can just reiterate that and the importance of building a relationship and providing a high level of service and not sales when you bring up this form.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
this doesn't need to be something scary. It more needs to be something informational and exciting
Mhm.
for the buyer. I truly don't think the compensation side is going to hinder a buyer from working and having some type of representation with you. You may have to have some hard conversations after the fact when you see a house pull up and the seller's not offering compensation. But hopefully by then you've had months of relationship building with
Mhm.
that buyer, and they see the value of you. They did the buyer's consultation. They've had you show them houses. While you're showing, you've brought up the pros and cons of houses built in before, lead-based paint or sewer scope problems, or, you've pointed out, you've added value throughout this whole time of working with them. And this one house that comes up that's not offering compensation doesn't need to be the end-all be-all for your guys' relationship.
Yeah.
So this just needs to be factual, helpful, and then move on.
And I think too, letting them know as like you said, we can have those conversations as they come up. And if the home does come up that is not offering compensation, even I'm saying that I can't show it to you, but I will have a conversation with that listing agent. So as far as the negotiations of my compensation, to make sure and see if they are willing to have an open mind and offer compensation so that we can go and look at this home.
Yeah, our
Mhm.
number one goal is to get you in a house that you love for a really long time, and you're not calling me in 6 months crying that you made a mistake. And one of those things I'm going to do is fight for you every step of the way, and that one of those things is part of compensation if they're not willing to offer it. Let's get creative. Not every real estate transaction is different. Like we mentioned in the buyer's consultation, this is a catered service. The reason they're purchasing a home is not the same reason that their friends or their family or their neighbor or whoever referred them to you is purchasing a home. And the reason we ask a lot of questions and we learn about you is to set you up for success. And this is just one of those extra things that we're going to do to make sure to set you up for success.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
Well, I think that's great the way that you go through it with them. And again, like Jessica and I were saying that I think it is a good thing. Honestly, I don't think it's a bad thing.
it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I think that the disclosure of it, because I mean, I have had a lot of, especially like first time home buyers that will come in and they have no idea how like compensation works, how we get paid. They think that they're paying for it, originally. And I think that the disclosure of letting people know, hey, this is what we make and what we work for. And I also think it's good for us to earn our value and let people know what we're doing for them, because they also, majority of the consumer has no idea what we're doing behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Like they don't understand what goes into it. So being able to disclose that and be more transparent about it and what we're doing for them and how we earn our compensation, I think is a good thing.
And most likely a lot of those conversations will never come up.
Yeah.
Still.
Exactly. I know. I think that this is truly going to be.
This is just to create a more black and white protection for you as an agent, honestly, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, and for your client on the list side and the buy side.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's all we really need to treat it as. We don't need to treat it as something scary or.
Right.
And
I think the biggest thing that's going to come up is the way, like how Jessica said, this is a really great thing that there's been some changes and they're really great and they benefit you. I think the more confidence that you have when addressing this and keeping it with this is a great thing is going to like set the example of how that's going to go over. Because if you're nervous about it or, the attitude that you have that's mirrored, your clients can see that and then their confidence will also drop in you.
Certainly. Yeah. It'll just set the tone how you start the presentation of this. So, really the only change compared to the last buyer rep agreement that we had is they can choose the type of agency, the time frame shortened by like half, and it gives different types of ways and disclosures for if there is extra compensation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, truly, nothing has changed.
Yeah.
So it honestly provides more options for you as an agent to represent your clients. That's not a bad thing. That's a great thing.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
And for them to see it on paper. So you just have to pay a little bit more attention to that top left green box than you probably were in the past.
Yeah. And I also think that it's a really good thing that we have to have this signed before we're putting in offers, because it does seem silly that that's where most of the buyer rep agreements were getting signed when, when you're telling somebody how, like, what your value is and how you're going to represent them as you're writing an offer, and it gets like just missed in that and they're initialing it. And half the time, I mean, how many people have we talked to that had no idea they even signed one of these?
Right, exactly. So just from the beginning, once your buyer consultation is over, and hopefully you've already done a good job establishing a relationship before that consultation as well.
Yeah.
And you've just spent an hour building trust with them and learning about them, and that this will be easy breezy.
Yeah.
So, if we go over, do you want to do some of these addendums?
Yeah.
Just Casey can split this up.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I think that addendum, so that would be, I guess, one of the things that came up a lot with, like, in the videos that I've watched with agents that are a little bit more concerned about this is exclusive and non-exclusive. And, as you're getting it in, one of the videos that Annie had where, like, you may not know these clients because you haven't showed them anything, you've just met with them, so they don't want to sign an exclusive agency agreement, which is, I mean, that's fine. And at that point, I would keep the term lower. And if you can't convince them to have that value of working with you as an exclusive agency, I would keep the term of it lower. And then within 30 days or whatever, you have your addendum for them to sign exclusively.
Yeah. Maybe we should present this as if someone's going to do a non-exclusive then.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I was working with someone who I knew automatically was not going to sign an exclusive agreement with me because maybe a scenario that Christina just brought up, we just met them. We met them at the house. We weren't able to get them in here for a buyer's consultation. Hopefully this doesn't come up very often,
Right.
but let's be realistic, it happens. One of the things that I would talk about still is try to explain the benefits of having an agent who is exclusively working for them, and then also, which you can just bring part of that out of your buyer consultation practice that you normally do. But if they're still stuck on non-exclusive, I would say, no problem. I look forward to in 30 days retouching on this with you and establishing that exclusive agency. Therefore, we'll set this agreement to around 30 days, and it does allow you to still continue to go out and work with other agents and speak with other agents. But again, the wonderful thing about this new form that we've brought in is any agent that you're going to talk to is going to have to legally have you sign this and bring this up. The reason that is because you need to be educated as a buyer in your options, whether it's exclusive, non-exclusive, different types of dual agency, and then also the way compensation has changed when you're out shopping for houses. Talk about that, which we brought up in the last video, and I would say go over your options on different types of compensation, and that way this just becomes, again, informational, educational, and not a binding agreement, which is a non-agency. It's not.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think too, like the thing that just said that is important too. Like, and that is great, and I look forward to addressing this again in another 30 days. But no matter what other agent, because you can work with other agents, so no matter what other agent that you're working with, you will have to sign this legally prior to them working with you, and it's purely about education, like educating you on how you're represented and how agents' compensation works and how it can be different.
And I wouldn't wait until after you've showed the house or after you've opened the door to get this signed.
No, that's
this
the thing
needs
is
to
you
be
have
before
to.
you open the door, because that is your value, that is your tool, that's what they need you for. Realistically, at the end of the day, there's going to be people like that. You're going to have investors like that. Most likely, I imagine a lot of people who've just bought and sold a lot of real estate who just want in really fast are going to be more of those non-agent types of people. Don't open the door until you've signed this. In Idaho, we have a form that from first contact, we legally have to have signed. And if we don't have it signed and they go tell our board, we can lose our license. Treat this very similarly.
Absolutely.
Because it's basically the same thing. This is purely educational, and you have to have them sign that they were able to review this information. That's what a non-exclusive checkbox under agency on number 3 is going to do at the end of the day, is just have them acknowledge that they were educated on what their options are in the state of Washington now. That's what this is at the end of the day.
Yeah. And legally, we do have to have the signed, prior to. So you're right. The value is prior to anything that we need to let them know where our value comes from prior to establishing that with them and getting the door opened. And
so I just have your elevator pitch ready. Hey, if you want to be non-exclusive, that's wonderful. There's different types of agencies. This house is not one that is listed by my firm, so we don't have to worry about different types of dual agency here. However, if I do show you this other option that I brought, we will want to talk about dual agency and how I don't represent both sides of a transaction. The next thing is in Washington, they made it very clear on how compensation is offered. I personally do not work for less than 2.5% compensation, and if the seller in this case is not offering 2.5%, are you comfortable making up that difference? If not, I'm probably not the agent for you, or this house is offering that 2.5%, so this isn't something we have to worry about. However, if for some reason, or when we go establish this exclusive agency relationship, now you've had an introduction to that type of conversation.
Yeah.
And then you can talk about if it's additional, how that gets paid for the firm, and go over the types of terms. I would just keep it really short and simple for types of people like that, and just, again, purely educational.
Yeah. So. And I think one of the biggest things too, so knowing this form inside and out, so going over it and yourself and having your elevator pitch ready where you're keeping it simple. Don't over explain each portion, because then that's where it, the client's eyes are glazing over and it gets scarier for them.
Yeah.
And then I think also really going over the new law of agency, and because it's going to have the information too in here that helps you with the wording that you need when you were explaining this to them.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to present this to them as well.
Yeah. So I'll just have a bunch of these printed in your car,
Mm-hmm.
hanging out.
Absolutely. Yeah, keep it
So-
with you all the time.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
have Idaho ones just in a file folder in my backpack at all times
Yep.
because you just don't know, honestly, when you're going to talk to someone,
Mhm.
and you have to keep, even if you end up like non-exclusive, not really working with this person ever again, you still need to send a copy to Jen and Haley
Yeah.
so they can keep a record of it. So 3 years from now, if something happens, you have some record of it.
Yeah.
But
And I know that, a lot of the people on the team are talking about how it's going to be like just being able to bring this up to people right away. But it doesn't, I would get over that fear right away, because the thing is no matter who they're talking to, they will have to sign it.
Yep.
So legally, you have to provide this. And so it's not that you're just trying to be pushy or shove it in their face to have any of our services or to start, applying any of them. These have to be signed.
And again, it's information for them to make sure that they understand how the process works. That's the root of it
Mm-hmm.
and the base of it. So you're just building on top of that. If for some reason, truly the only reason this becomes scary to most people, I think, most agents, is if compensation is not offered by a listing.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to have that scary conversation with them until it comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't need to be from step one.
Yes.
This is just educational and lets them go over their options, lets them make a choice. And then from there, we can have scary conversations if it comes up.
And I think too, I mean, you think about our industry has been so unique in the way of where we haven't had to have these compensation discussions with a lot of our clients. And I mean, any other field, CPA, attorney, all of these are laid out prior to even having these conversations. So it's not like it's an unusual thing to have an agreement signed prior to working with somebody.
Yeah. I personally have been having these exact conversations with my clients from day one just because
Mhm.
I feel more transparent about them.
Absolutely.
And I have never once had a buyer not work with me because of it. And I've put in our old agreement, you can put in a minimum compensation.
I have too.
And I've always put one in. And I've
Me too.
never once had anyone say, oh, well, I don't want to work with you. And even with having Paul as a showing assistant, he always knew, hey, before we go see a house, both of us were automatically trained to look at that top left corner
Mhm.
and see if it was less. Paul knew I always put 2.5% in our agreements. And if it was less than 2.5%, he'd call me or I would notice. And I would call the client and say, hey, remember in our consultation when we went over how if the seller is not offering the minimum compensation of 2.5% that we agreed to, we'd have a conversation. This is one of those houses. And I'd have the numbers already for them. You know,
Mhm.
is it $5,000? Is it $2,000? Is it 15? Whatever. Say, hey, is this house worth, an additional possible 15,000 to you?
Mhm.
Is it? Wonderful. Let's schedule a showing, but just know that that's going to be additional out of your pocket.
Yeah.
Or is it not? And 99% of the time, it wasn't.
Yeah.
They were just like, oh, no, not worth it to us then. We'll go find a different one.
Mhm.
I only had one time where someone was like, yeah, actually, I do really want to see that. And I said, okay, great. I'm going to call the list agent, see if that is negotiable.
Mhm.
Called the list agent. It was not negotiable. Called my client back, let them know that the seller was not willing to budge on offering that, even if we came up in compensation. So it was going to be an additional, it was like $9,500 out of my client's cost to close. And they said they were comfortable with it. I had them sign something
Mhm.
stating that. And we went out, showed the house. They didn't even like it anyways.
So
It doesn't
was-
even matter. So I just don't think that this needs to be anything scary on top of conversations and experiences that you've probably already been having, but maybe just not as transparent from the very beginning.
Yeah, not as thoroughly.
And we know you're going to need $200,000 to get there, and so let's make sure we even have that minimum. Let's
Mhm.
make sure we, hopefully you've at least done a little bit of research and you found out a little bit about them while you're
Mhm.
walking through the house and what
Yeah.
they're wanting next. But I really don't have that conversation with them until they're here.
Yeah. And I always have that conversation with them on the second time too. But and I've probably only had pushback with like all the listings I've done maybe twice as far as somebody asking me at that first meeting what my fees were.
Yeah.
Typically it doesn't come up that often.
No, most
Until-
people are too scared to ask.
Yeah, until I get to talking about like till I'm
Yeah.
going over the listing agreement with them.
Yeah, I've had it. I have. Okay. Do you want a video?
Yeah.
Just, and then we'll go over all these things again.
I just hit record because you guys started talking smart stuff.
Oh.
I was like, all right, I'm just going to hit
Okay,
record.
great.
Okay, so this is going over conversations that we're having with our sellers and things that we can say because at this point we cannot say that this is the industry standard as far as compensation, and we have to educate them on the value of what it looks like in our market if they are paying for a compensation to or offering a compensation to the buyer's agent, and then what it looks like if they have chosen that's not that they don't want to, so that they have again transparency of what it looks like for their home if they're not offering these things.
Right. So currently, our listing agreement forms have not changed. So we still just have that bottom section where we have the total and then the
Buyer firms.
buyer firms compensation percentage in there. So I feel like we don't need to change this too much in the way we're communicating it right now. Will this form probably change? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
However, I feel like when I have a conversation with my list or my seller clients, it's in my best interest as well as theirs to let them know the conversations that buyer agents are going to be having with their buyers. So I would probably start to bring up these changes.
Yeah.
Because
I think having this form with you during your listing consultations too. you know?
yeah, yeah, just so that they can see, hey, here when we talk about compensation, here is if they have pushback on offering compensation.
Yeah,
Here's
exactly.
exactly what they're seeing. So how does compensation or commission even come up in the beginning? When do you bring that up in a conversation, in a seller presentation? Or,
Yeah. So I always offer a seller net sheet with them, like you said that you do. So compensation will come up typically when I am going over comps. Well, I go over comps. We set a price at that point, and then I will have it as it's like the agent one-page detail. So it has the compensation that's offered in the corner, and I show them that these are the comparable homes that sold days on market, and show them like typically honestly the higher compensations do sell faster. And then I'll show them the competition, so homes that are active on the market and what they're offering, and if they are usually, I mean, hopefully this would be an advantage that you have when you're doing this, that the days on market is probably more if they're offering less, because it really does tend to end up that way.
Okay.
But then, so I'll talk to them about that, and that this is my fee on my end, and then as far as like buyer broker compensation, if they're asking me what I think that would be, like what would you suggest I offer, you can't suggest that you offer like a standard, or what the industry standard is. You could say, my fee as a buyer broker is this, and then this is what your competition is, and what the comps show, the sold comps of what they've offered. So again, it's up to you, seller, what you want to offer, but this gives you the information of what
Okay.
we're seeing right now.
And we're having these, for me, I'm having these conversations not at someone's house. For instance, had a gal call me this morning and she said, hey, so-and-so gave me your phone number. I'm looking at selling my house. I want to move back to Montana. What does your process look like? I said, wonderful. Tell me a little about your home, because I want them to get excited a little bit. So they
Yeah.
tell me about their house, and then I say, great. So the first thing I like to do is I like to come over and just walk the house through a buyer's eyes, take notes, and then you walk me through the house, point out things that you loved about living here, things maybe that are behind the walls that I wouldn't notice just walking through, any special types of flooring, upgrades, things like that. And then from there, we'll schedule a second meeting, and I'll have you come to my office. We'll go over comparables, we'll go over numbers, we'll go over the market, just set you up for success on your move back to Montana. And that's where, in that second meeting,
Yeah.
is when I bring up my net sheet. So
Me too.
I-
Mine's always a second meet. I
Okay.
do it at their house a lot of times though, but it's
Yeah.
the second time. And it's not the first time I meet with them at their house.
Okay. Yeah. So when they come in, then at the end of my consultation, I'll go over the market first. So in our packet, it talks a lot about the importance of pricing so that I can loop all this back to things that we just talked about. So I have my comps, much like you said, and let the sellers kind of say, okay, here's a price that we were looking for. Usually they have a number in mind. Most sellers do before
Yeah.
they even meet with you. And so it gives them the opportunity to say their number first. And then you can talk, and maybe your number matches. Love it. Move
Yeah.
on. Most
Highly
of the time
unlikely,
it doesn't. Most of the time it doesn't. And you can talk about educate them, get them down to the number that you guys can agree on. Once you have that, or I have that number, I usually open my computer and I pull up Fatco's net sheet and I put in, and right there, I put in what we're going to sell for, what day I think it will sell. I put in, I ask them, do they have a mortgage payoff? Is there anything else? I put all those in there. And then I used to put in just my automatic 7%, and I would change it to 4.5% list side, 2.5% buy side. I'd add the $600 transaction fee, $500 utility holdback, anything else that I think might need to be in there. And then I'd show it to them and say, here's all the fees broken down with at our agreed upon sales price. Or I sometimes say your worst case scenario sales price. So whatever's lower is usually what I put in there. And then we can go through all of that. Are we still allowed to put in those fees and say, this is my standard? If we can't say industry standard, can we say this is my standard for
Yes,
fees?
yours alone. This is what I charge my fees, but you can't say what the buyer's fee would be. That's
So
the
I
thing.
can say the 4.5%, but I can't put in the 2.5%.
Yes, you can have a standard for your firm. You can't choose. You can't. They have to. You can't put a standard as
Okay.
far as what your fee would be for another firm.
Okay, so then at that time, that I would probably just put in the 4.5%, and then I would most likely say, okay, the only fee that we're not seeing in here that is something that I would recommend so that we can reach the most amount of buyers possible, because we just went through a whole presentation on how that is extremely important. The more buyers you reach, the larger your buyer pool, hopefully the more offers that you get, the more demand you create for your house, all the important things. One of the things that you guys can do to increase buyer demand for your home is offer a compensation to the agent who brings you the buyer.
Yeah.
And then you could maybe, like you said, pull it back to those comps and say, these comps that we just went through, in those comps, these sellers offered compensation to the buyers. The ones who offered lower or didn't, those will probably come up more and more as this continues to go on this year. But, here's what they offered. When I work with a buyer, here's the forms that I have to present to the buyer and we're agreeing upon. And I personally work with a buyer and ask for a minimum of 2.5% of the purchase price and compensation. And I always usually ask them like a question that says that I want them to agree with me.
Yeah.
And I usually say, would you agree that adding compensation like these other sellers who ended up selling, and with buyers who are hopefully working with a buyer's agent, which will set you guys up for success and out of litigation, wouldn't you agree that it would be smart to offer a form of compensation to the person who brings you a buyer? They're probably going to say yes. And then say, wonderful. Based off these comps, what does that number look like to you?
Yeah.
And then I would add it in to my net sheet. And if they say something really low, then I just keep relating it back to the comps and just have factual conversations.
Well, and I also think too, at that point, if it comes to this where we because again, I don't think that this will come up often to where it's like, pushback of it. But I think one of the words that Annie used a lot was incentives to the buyers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, if you're getting pushback about it, say they're like, well, let's just offer a $500 flat fee or something, and you're like, okay, great. And with these new changes in Washington State as of January 1st, the buyers now have the option to let their agent know if they even want to look at homes that aren't offering their minimum of what the buyer's agents has put in for their compensation. So there is a chance that with the agents that are or buyers that are working with agents, though they will not even show them their home or know right off the bat that they're not going to look at your home if the buyer can't afford to come up with that extra amount or they're unwilling to.
Right. And you can go back in your MLS at that time and show and put in where it says compensation when you're pulling your comps. And I like to show when you enter certain criteria how much that number changes.
Yeah.
And if you put in 2.5% and nothing pops up, that would help them. But what's going to happen is you're in 2.5% and that number's not going to change.
Right.
And so then you're going to say if agents now know that these things have to be signed when I'm working with a buyer and I know that they have agreed to pay a minimum of 2.5% and they really can't afford to pay the difference of that, I'm going to be entering that into our search criteria. And so if your house doesn't meet that, it's not going to be a house that I send. That's probably not in your best interest.
Right. So as far as marketability, when new homes come on the market and it's in somebody's search criteria, it goes out to that buyer right away. But if that search criteria includes it being less than, the compensation that you're offering is less than, it will not, even if everything else fits that buyer's criteria.
Yeah, it won't show. So you can show them that and they can see it. That's why I like to make sure I'm having these conversations. It's really important in front of a computer where you can show them what you're seeing on your end and how that will ultimately affect them on their end.
So again, seller, what incentive do you think would be most important for you to offer to make your home the most marketable in our current market? Well, homes aren't selling like hotcakes.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that we are showing to the masses.
Yeah.
And I do think as time goes on with homes that are not offering compensation, we will be able to see that price difference in them. Not right now. I don't think we can have those conversations, but down the line, if they are not, we will see the days on market and the price change as far as what they.
But even if we're not seeing it right now, it's still helpful for you for when you do enter that. They're going to see that every single house is offering compensation.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So they're going to say, to, like you said, match the incentives that others are offering. Why would they choose your identical home over the one down the street?
Yeah.
Then that is going to be something that is important to them, obviously.
And they've already decided that they don't want to.
Yeah.
That that buyer has already, majority of those buyers have probably already decided that they don't want to look at those. They don't want their agent to show them that home.
Well,
They get those options ahead of time.
or that their agent just won't.
Yeah.
And so then that agent is having that conversation with them and they say at the end of the day, okay, then I guess it's not important to me to see that house.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
That's all the things that we're going to run into when you wrap in this form.
Yeah.
So,
which I think is also a good thing.
Yeah.
That we're having these conversations and that sellers can see, what the difference is and what the value is to be able to pay that incentive.
And I would, if you're really, really, really getting pushback, I would bring up the variable compensation option and say, well, we can just offer that the compensation is purely variable. And so depending on the offer that you receive, we can talk about what that compensation looks like. Again, if we do that, we could run into the problem of your house not even populating on buyers' searches.
Yeah.
And so, but that is an option too that you can just talk with them about.
Yeah.
So
I think that's one thing that one of the videos that I watched said, as far as like, if you're getting a bunch of pushback from that seller, to say, okay, I understand that you do not want to offer it, and we can address this at a later date after we see how it goes. Make sure that you have it in your agreement that at this time we're going to look at this again, or they know the timeline of what it is. And in the meantime, I would really like you to keep an open mind. If we do get an offer and an agent is asking for, a buyer's agent is asking for that compensation, are you willing to, at least look at it and see what that looks like?
Yeah, because if we don't offer, I guarantee you I'm going to be having agents call me and say, is that something you're open to? And if it's not something you're open to, I need to know now so I can let them know. That will likely translate, however, into very few showings. Is it something you're open to depending on the offer that you receive?
Right.
Yes, fantastic. Then, I'll put that in the notes that hopefully agents can see that. But again, I think if you just go over the comps and show and talk about the incentive, that terminology is really going to be really important in the way that you present it. It will be something that most people will understand.
Yeah.
So
And I think too, with like how Jess said, having your computer pulled up and being able to show them as far as, because I don't know how that's going to compute with searches as far as a variable. Like, when you're putting in
exactly.
that compensation portion, how that, because
Probably
there's,
going to show as zero.
you know how like most fields we can click on the criteria, that is something that you actually fill in. And a lot of like, if an agent just puts 3, then we have to do like 3 point, like we're going to have to do all those variations of how that compensation pulls up.
Right. Or just have a variable option so you can search just V or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, even like if like you're putting in a commission portion, some agents.
I know. Like it's
some
just going to
put
have to
some
change.
put the percentage, some put, like we're going to have to do all of those different variables when we're putting in our searches.
Right. So, again, that's just more education that you can provide to your clients. And I think if you start the conversation off with the net sheet showing and then say, these are all, here's all the fees that we're starting with. And I want to bring back and make sure that we are adding all the incentives so that we can reach the largest amount of buyer pools, or again, word it as, wouldn't you agree it would be smart to increase our buyer pool as much as we can? By one of the ways we can do that, or you can do that as a seller, is offer an incentive, and that incentive comes in the form of offering compensation to the agent who brings a buyer for your property.
Yeah.
And then talk about that. Then you've already kind of got them agreeing to the idea, and it won't seem as scary from then on.
Right.
And Annie Fitzsimmons, you mentioned, had, if you want to go over the way she talked about the three different costs.
She talked about, she was getting a lot of questions from designated brokers that were worried that they couldn't even have these conversations with their sellers, which I'm terrified that if designated brokers are thinking that where this is going to land. But she was saying, yes, absolutely, you can have these conversations, and you're going to say, okay, here's the incentives as far as you're going over with your client, you're going over as far as seller price, you're going over, condition of the home, and then based on that condition, what type of financing that the buyer can, that it can apply for. So if it's VA and FHA, conventional, and then obviously cash. So when you're talking about financing, at that point, she was saying to your seller, you tell them, in years past, a buyer has always had, we know that when they come, they are qualified for your home. They have a down payment that they may have been saving for years or months, however long it took them to get that chunk of money. And then buyers have had the funds for closing costs, or they are, a portion coming up with some sort of assistance, or they're asking the seller for that. And now the buyers have also another variable, a large chunk of money that they have to come up with, which is their agent's compensation. And when we're looking at the marketability of your home, if those buyers already have to, they have in their mind that they're coming up, with their down payment and closing costs, and now they have to get their buyer broker's compensation, and it is a choice if they, as far as if they want to do that or not, then an incentive to get those buyers to your home would be, taking care of that hurdle for them so that we can get the buyers to the closing table and be able to actually afford your home.
Right.
And as far as financing with VA, a buyer can't do that with their financing. So if you are unwilling to pay that compensation, we cannot market your home to VA buyers.
Which just shortens your buyer pool even more.
Right. So we're bringing this due to financing. Our buyer pool gets smaller and smaller of who can actually afford or buy your home.
Right.
Hmm.
Perfect. I
Mhm.
think that's a great thing to bring up if you get even more pushback.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. It wouldn't be something. You're right that I would bring up right off the bat because it would be if they have more questions and you're trying that conversation as far as educating them on what happens in a market when they're not offering it.
Yep. And just don't use that word standard, or I
Yeah.
would just keep using it.
I don't even
as-
think that we can use the word commission.
No, I think compensation.
It's got to be compensation.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think the more you can view this personally as educational, and the more you will translate that and set the tone for your clients that having this conversation is educational. And at the end of the day, that seller is interviewing you to represent them in their best interests.
Mhm.
And I wholeheartedly believe that part of their best interest is to reach the largest buyer pool.
Mhm.
And so just educating them on the importance of that, that's what you're doing at the end of the day. You're not convincing them to spend, you're not trying to pull a fast one on them or convince them to spend thousands of more dollars.
Right.
You're educating them on the best way to get their home sold.
Mhm.
That's what you're doing at the end of the day. And if you can view it that way and translate it that way to your clients, it's going to come off and set the tone for your whole conversation versus I'm trying to convince you how to spend 20 grand or lose 20 grand when you sell this house.
Right.
That's not what we're doing at the end of the
No.
day. And don't have that mindset when you're coming into having these conversations. You're setting them up for their future, for all those conversations, all those things that you've learned about what their end goal is. And a lot of those are going to come down to what other past people and current people are doing to get their home sold.
Mhm.
And so if you relate it back to those comps, you're having great legal, educational conversations.
Yeah. Well, and our
So-
job is to educate them in the current market and what we're seeing, but also what will make their home the most marketable. And that's truly what we're trying to do to sell their home at the best price for them
Yeah.
in the best condition. And marketability is a large portion of what our job is and what is going to make their home the most marketable.
Yeah.
Offering these
Truly,
incentives.
in a broken down essence, this is just like convincing them the importance of professional photography.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
it's just helping them understand, like you said, the marketability of their home. And this is just another tool and incentive that they can offer to market their home.
Yeah.
So,
And I think either way, biggest thing, like what Jess said with the buyer's agreement too, is keeping it where this is a great thing. Where Washington State has made changes about transparency and how you as a buyer, seller, client can be represented in the state of Washington, and so keeping that like light and that it's great that we're going to be more transparent about it as an industry as a whole, which is a good thing. We always have been, and now everyone has to be.
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, awesome. Okay.
Cool. So I just pushed that button.
I think so. Is there anything else that
I can't think of anything unless you can. Oops.